Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and participants across the country, wherever you may be joining us for this evening's session on Australia and the world after Trump. It has been a whirlwind 24 hours. Many of us are reeling from the constant refresh on our devices to see just where the seats are at, where the polls are at, what this means, of course, for America and by extension for Australia. So we're very much looking forward to the session. My name is Tasneem Chopra. I will be your MC for this evening, and we have a lot packed into the next 90 or so minutes, so please stick around. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon where we're gathered, all of us, wherever we may be across Australia, and in particular pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. This land always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. So this evening's program is going to be quite a coloured event. We have panellists, we have conversations, we have entertainment. We have the full gamut covered, all encompassing a broader issue, of course, of Australia-US relations, what this means. And we'll be hearing not just from public intellectuals, but very prominent Australian young leaders as well. So we're getting a cross-section of perspectives, and we will be inviting you as well to participate by asking your questions in the chat function that you have there. And of course, very importantly, this event also marks the formal launch of Conversations at the Crossroad. And who better to speak to that than, of course, the founder of this particular initiative. And I would like to introduce Professor Joe Camilleri, who most of you would know. But for those of you who don't, who may have been living under a rock for some decades, I'm going to give you a short overview of Joe. This is the abridged version because there's an extensive one, but that would be a whole panel. So Joe Camilleri is Emeritus Professor at La Trobe University, where he held the chair in international relations for almost 2 decades. He was founding director of the Centre for Dialogue and is a fellow of the Australian Academy for Social Sciences, managing director of Alexandria Agenda, which is a new venture in ethical consulting. He's authored some 30 major books, written over 100 journal articles, chapters, and the topics he's covered include security, dialogue, conflict resolution, religion, culture, global governance, pretty much the bread and butter of what we'll be covering tonight. He covers both Australia and the Asia-Pacific region, and he's convened several international dialogues and conferences and brings enormous expertise to this particular event. His most recent publication, which some of you might be across, is Towards a Just and Ecologically Sustainable Peace. Please welcome Joe as he discusses the Conversations at the Crossroads project.
Thank you very much, Tasneem. For many months now, we have lived in Australia and of course the rest of the world under the shadows of the pandemic. We live in hope, of course. COVID-19 may soon be tamed, but this is hardly the only cloud on the horizon. Think climate change, poverty, race, great power conflicts, economic turbulence, the list goes on. We have much to be anxious about. Ours has been called the age of anxiety. The future is uncertain. We're uneasy about the future. Our own personal future, study, work, mortgages, parenting, relationships, or lack of them. We're uneasy about the future of our children, the future of our communities, local, professional, religious, the future of the nation, the world, the planet. We're uneasy, uncertain, anxious, at times depressed. How could it be otherwise? So much that's not right with the world. So much disregard for life, so much hatred and animosity, cruelty, destruction of all that is alive. In the face of such unpleasantness, our natural reaction is to shield ourselves, to screen ourselves off. The addiction to the screen we're well aware of, to withdraw into ourselves. And yet this is not all. We're also drawn to contact. To human contact, contact with nature. We're drawn to contact, empathy, compassion, communication, community. Yes, we are at the crossroads, But it is exactly at the crossroads that empathy, compassion, communication, community come into their own. It's where conversation comes into its own. Conversation? What do you mean, conversation, some may ask? In conversation, we come together. We're in touch with each other. In conversation, we share our anxieties, hopes, aspirations. In conversation, we reflect more deeply on our options. We bounce off each other's ideas, suggestions, proposals. We prepare for the future. We do this in words, of course, words that we speak, words of others that we listen to. And don't let's forget, for we do so at our peril, the words we read, we ought to read, the words we write. Of course, newspapers, magazines, books, articles, we read, and some of us write. But also hundreds of messages we send and receive via email, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and much else. And not just conventional words, but words can be in poetry. Not just words, but other ways of communicating through gestures of various kinds. Art, the other visual arts, music, other performing arts, sport, meditation, and food. We can't emphasize enough the importance of sharing food. This is what we, Conversation at the Crossroads, are committed to doing. We plan vibrant conversations on the issues critical to our future. Lively, friendly events, small and large, virtual and physical, events that bridge the generational and cultural divides, that create new hope and inspire change. Some may say, but is conversation not something we do every day? This initiative looks to conversation with a different eye, to conversations that do several things, that help us to look at causes, not just symptoms, that enable us to see how everything is connected to everything else, that help us to join the dots, to seize the big picture within which particular problems and issues take their full significance. In our highly interdependent world, the problems can often be simultaneously local, national, international, often global in scope. And so the solutions must be as well. And because we're interested in change, we need to look closely at the roadblocks that obstruct change. Proposed remedies won't work unless we see how we can overcome these roadblocks. We have to see how existing mindsets and institutions need to be reviewed if they are to be fit for purpose. To be effective then, conversation requires knowledge. It requires access to reliable sources of information and a range of learning and other skills. Of course, we know we can't do this alone. We will have to engage with professions, with business, with unions, community organizations, and diverse networks, Australian and international. And all this in ways that show respect for others, nurture friendships, deepen trust, and develop a sense of community. Viewed in this way, conversation becomes transformational. It's the most powerful tool for change we have. And the marvel of it is that it is within everyone's reach. Conversation then is active. We need to promote and advocate conversation, to conduct and facilitate conversation, to skill and empower, action unlimited, action to last a lifetime. This evening then, as we launch Conversation at the Crossroads, I invite you, your friends, colleagues, to join us, to support, publicize, engage in the project and its activities, and importantly, offer us your ideas and advice. This is an invitation to all of you to be part of this bold and I hope exciting a journey towards the future.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. And I will be giving some more information a little bit later on through the session about exactly how you can join and support this initiative, because there are various ways that it can be done. But moving right along with the program for today, our next piece of action comes from a presentation, an interview actually that was conducted a few hours ago between both Joe and a special guest who is John Nichols. Now, this interview was pre-recorded simply because John is in New York, and to have done it live would have been 3 a.m. his time, which would not have made for the most engaging, perhaps, interview. So I do believe that Joe conducted this interview only a few hours ago. So for all intents and purposes, the content holds up, it is engaging, and a little bit about John Nichols for those of you who aren't across his work. John writes for The Nation. He's their national affairs correspondent and is known internationally for his work. In fact, his writing has even been the subject of debates on the Congress floor. He is a frequent guest on radio and TV. He commentates on politics and media and is a best-selling author. His books include, and I do love this title, Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, a field guide to the most dangerous people in America, and The Genius of Impeachment. Of Nichols, Gore Vidal has said famously, of all the giant slayers now afoot in the great American desert, John Nichols' sword is the sharpest. So that's quite a commendation. Please enjoy this interview with John and Joe.
And so I will tell you that we are indeed very, very close to having a president, a declaration, if you will. And it looks very much like it's going to be Joe Biden. That is not assured. You always have twists and turns, and when you're dealing with 50 states and the District of Columbia. But right now, with the declared states, you have Joe Biden just 6 votes short, 6 electoral votes short of an electoral college win. And if indeed the counting that's going on now in Nevada, which has 6 electoral votes, continues to go in Biden's favor, there is a very good chance that tonight or perhaps tomorrow, it will be inevitable that he is the winner. We also have several other states that are counting right now, including Georgia, which has turned into a surprising situation. There is a possibility that Biden could win Georgia. And then, of course, we still have our big state of Pennsylvania, which is counting. It will probably take another couple days. I could go state by state, but I think the bottom line is that there is not a certainty, but a possibility that Joe Biden could actually win a rather substantial electoral college victory, not a landslide, but certainly a sufficient enough victory to make it unlikely that Donald Trump's challenges would be very effective. And then there's one final thing. Of course, we have this dual system where we have popular vote and the electoral college. In the popular vote, Biden is opening up a pretty massive lead. He now has received more votes than anyone ever in American history, more than 70 million votes. And he has a roughly 3.5 million vote lead over Donald Trump in the popular vote. So
that's a bigger lead than Hillary Clinton did.
Yes. So it's looking like a pretty good night or a pretty good couple days for Joe Biden.
So assuming we do get a Biden presidency, what will be Trump's reaction near term?
In the near term, Donald Trump has already said that he has won the election. And he has also said that the people who are counting ballots now are somehow violating the rights of his supporters. And he has launched lawsuits to try and stop the count in several states. He has also asked for a recount in the critical state of Wisconsin. So he'll keep challenging. And I think that people have actually, oddly enough, gotten used to Donald Trump doing this. This is what was expected. It doesn't seem to be getting a lot of traction, however, because Biden seems to be succeeding on so many fronts in so many states that it's not as easy for Trump as it would be if there was, say, one state which was very, very close.
So, but what's the mood? How would you describe the mood in the US at this time? both as we were leading up to the election and, of course, since the vote has taken place. There are lots and lots of issues, aren't there, and problems on the horizon, and sometimes much closer than the horizon. How would you describe the mood? It must vary from one part of the US to the other.
Certainly. On the eve of the election, I can tell you that the national mood was very, very tense. There was really a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen. And especially on election night, it became even more tense because the election didn't follow normal patterns. You saw some states where Biden was expected to do well, where he didn't do well. Other states where he did unexpectedly well, and vice versa with Trump. So that tension really was palpable last night. It's eased a good deal today, but that's just the politics. What you're really asking about is sort of all of the issues that are in play. And the fact is, we are in the midst of a coronavirus surge that is very, very serious. Many of our states are having record levels of coronavirus cases and deaths, and that is expected to increase as we move into winter. So that's created a lot of real tension and real concern about not just the disease, but the economic impact. And when Joe Biden in one of the debates referred to us leading into a long, dark winter, that was the quote, he was in fact right. It's looking daunting. We have not gotten ahead of the coronavirus as I think Australia has. And we've got some real issues there. In addition, in the United States right now, we have a lingering challenge as regards racial justice. And there is simply no question that the events of last summer, which involved the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, the shooting of Jacob Blake by a Kenosha, Wisconsin police officer, a number of other incidents that really added up to a great deal of tension in the summer, a lot of demonstrations, real pressure for action on that. Donald Trump resisted that action, actually opposed it very strongly, but that issue is quite front and center in a lot of cities across the country. And I think it's still very much an unresolved issue that the next president's going to have to deal with. And finally, we're really feeling the impacts of the climate crisis. And we have had historic fires in California, more and more hurricanes hitting in places like Florida and Louisiana, and just an unprecedented level of developments that an awfully lot of people see as very closely related to the climate crisis. It's notable that today the United States formally left the Paris Accords, which is a really a play out of Donald Trump's presidency by any measure. But it's also notable that if Donald Trump has lost the presidency, you will see a rapid reversal as regards some of the climate issues, and also I think a very, very different direction on coronavirus and the economy. So we're at a pivot point. It's a critical juncture. These issues are pressing on us as a country. If Biden becomes president, he will not have an easy task. In fact, he will have a number of overwhelming issues to deal with very quickly. And he will not, at least as best I can tell at this point, not have a United States Senate controlled by the Democrats. And so what that means is he'll have divided government, which makes it much harder to deal with a crisis.
Of course, as allies of the United States in Europe, and of course that includes Australia, what the United States says and does and what happens inside the country and certainly outside impacts greatly. Do you think, looking at it from outside, as perhaps we would try and do, a Biden presidency, not just the man, but the people around him are up to the task of facing this extraordinary array of challenges, including ones we haven't spoken of yet, relations with China, which is of great concern to Australia, of course, and the rise of tensions with Russia and difficult relationships with allies, which no doubt will improve under Biden. But even so, a huge agenda is the Biden presidency likely to be equal to the challenge? And number one, the people around him, do they really have, or the ones he is likely to choose for key positions, likely to have what would be called a genuinely progressive agenda?
It's a great question, and with many moving parts within it. And what I would tell you is that Joe Biden is a man of the Senate, of the United States Senate. He served there for many decades before he became vice president. And he served there in many international or foreign policy capacities. And so he has decades of experience dealing with international issues. One of his primary areas of interest as a US Senator was nuclear disarmament. And so he knows leading figures in most of the major countries of the world. There's no question that if Joe Biden does become president, he will know a lot of people, for instance, in Australia. He'll have a far broader level of familiarity with Australian issues, with leaders, some of them from the past, but also some contemporary folks. And the same goes with China, the same goes with Russia. So Biden is a radically different figure than Donald Trump. Donald Trump knew people around the world, but they were mainly business associates, and it had very little to do with governance. Biden's the opposite of that. And what you will see with Biden is an immediate dialing down of tensions. And in the campaign, there was a lot of rhetoric about China, but the truth of the matter is that I think Joe Biden will move very, very quickly to appoint an ambassador who can work closely with China. Biden will actually enjoy, I think, the process of rebuilding relations. It doesn't mean that the US and China will always agree on everything, not at all, or that the US and Russia will. But that the notion that Biden is going to be looking for fights, I think is really an unrealistic one. He is an internationalist, and my sense is very oriented toward diplomacy.
I think that concludes the interview with John and Joe. So thank you very much for that. There was a lot in there, a lot of aha moments and issues which I hope will come up in conversation. Again, I would encourage any of you who have questions you want to ask to these issues to our other panelists coming up to enter those into the chat box. And we ask in the spirit of Conversations at the Crossroads that we keep our questions respectful and our dialogue civil. So next up, I wanted to get to the next item on our agenda, and that will be our first official keynote speaker or guest speaker, and that is Mary Kaldor. So Mary Kaldor is a professor of global governance and director of Conflict and Civil Society Research Unit at the London School of Economics. She also directs the Conflict Research Programme, investigating public authority through a lens of political markets and the concept of civicness across a range of countries, including Africa and the Middle East. Welcome, Mary, to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Joe for this wonderful initiative. I think we're definitely at a crossroads, and it's not just an American crossroads, it's a global crossroads, and it's much deeper than Trump. Trump is what the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci would have called a morbid symptom, in his famous phrase that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this period, you observe morbid symptoms. And so what is the old? The old is what we might call the American model of development, with mass production, mass consumption, intensive use of fossil fuels, militarization. And the new, we hope, is a green world, resource saving, making a lot of use of information and communications technologies. Maybe oddly, we've had a sort of glimpse of that during the COVID period, during our lockdowns, when nature came back to life, and when we chose, like now, to Zoom instead of travel halfway across the world. So, how do we deal with the morbid symptoms? If we want to get to the new, we somehow have to overcome the morbid symptoms, and that is the challenge of our time. You know, whatever happens in this election, and I was very happy to see this interview with John McNichol, if Biden wins, he's still got to deal with the social monster that is Trump. It is really scary that 68 million Americans voted for Trump. How did we get there, and how do we deal with it? I think, first of all, it's important to say that Trumpism is not an isolated phenomenon. I mean, we're seeing it in my own country in the Brexit phenomenon and the Boris Johnson phenomenon. We're seeing it in India with Modi, in Russia with Putin, in Hungary with Orban, in Brazil with Bolsonaro. I'd put Xi Jinping perhaps in a different category, as more like a more classic authoritarian leader, but that's something we could discuss. You Australians know much more about it than I do. But what is this phenomenon? And a friend of mine put it, I think, very well by saying it's a mixture of crony capitalism, extremist identity politics, racism, ethnic nationalism, religious fundamentalism, and toxic masculinity. It involves misogyny and homophobia. So why has it come about? Well, I think it's the consequence of decades of neoliberal globalization. And it's a consequence both from below and from above. In fact, you could argue that neoliberal globalization itself was a reaction to the exhaustion of the American model of development already in the 1970s and 1980s. I won't go into it, but we could talk about it. So on the one hand, from below, it has led to extreme inequalities. And this was especially after the 2008 financial crisis. The combination of liberalization and austerity had the burden of somehow dealing with public debt has fallen on the poorest people. And the banks and the financial institutions weren't even sanctioned after the 2008 financial crisis. And so what it's left is large parts of the world that are just in despair. You know, whether we're talking about the Rust Belt in America, what we call the red wall seats in Britain that fell to Boris Johnson in the last election, large parts of Eastern and Central Europe, the old industrial areas that we call the left behind or the places that don't matter. But at the same time, something's happening from above. And that's what you might call crony capitalism. The growth of global finance has meant that governments rely much more on what you might call rents than on taxation. They rely on borrowing and mineral revenue to finance their activities. And that has been compounded by the sort of contracting out culture, whereby private companies undertake public functions. And so what you've got, and I've observed it in many parts of the world over the last few years, but it's certainly now applies to places like Britain and America, is a sort of oligarchical system in which the oligarchs finance political campaigns, and when the politicians win power, they hand out contracts to their friends. In a way, America's always had it through the military-industrial complex, but Trump has brought it to a whole new level with his family of companies with interests in places like Russia and Israel. In my own country, just to give you an example, the government has spent millions for a test and trace system, paying not local authorities to do it, but the companies that supported them in the campaign. Companies like Deloitte, an accounting firm. And they don't know how to do it. It's a mess. But as a consequence, they don't even have enough money to deal with the people who voted for them. So the problem these guys face is that they actually can't solve any of the problems. Protectionism, trade protectionism, really doesn't work in an interconnected global world because you need the imports to make the exports. Controlling migration really doesn't work because it doesn't create jobs where you need them, and it creates shortages. It doesn't create jobs for the people who voted for Trump, but it creates shortages in other areas of the economy. Geopolitical saber rattling doesn't seem to work very well either. You're always on the edge of nervousness about where it might lead. Classic military force doesn't seem to be able to do anything other than destroy things. And it doesn't help the people who voted for you. So, you know, we're in a real conundrum. And in past periods of history, when we've been in positions like this, we've had a major war. We've had big interstate wars, and they've been horribly destructive. They've killed millions of people, but at the same time, they've also transformed the world order, transformed how states do things, and allowed something new to develop. And so we can't go that route. It would be the end of the planet. But can we go some other route? Does COVID offer us an opportunity for a similar kind of transformation? What do we need to do now? What would we need the COVID pandemic to do? Well, I think we need to shift. And in a way, the pandemic's already shown us that. You need to do a lot more at a local level, but you also need to do a lot more at a global level. We need the global level to create space for us to do stuff at local levels. We need to be able to regulate the global bads, things like multinational corporations. They need to be taxed, Amazon, Google, and so on. We need to be able to control financial speculation. And maybe that means capital controls. We need to reduce carbon emissions. We need to try and stop wars. And we need to be able to promote global goods. We need massive social redistribution. We need global cooperation on healthcare. That's very clear out of COVID. You know, we need to cooperate on vaccines and treatments. We need to cooperate on peace building. The lack of cooperation is so evident in Syria, a conflict I study a lot. We need massive global green infrastructure, renewable energy, and we need an ICT infrastructure so everybody can communicate. And at the same time, many of the problems can only be solved at the local level. So you need to protect the local level from those global bads. And of course, I forgot to add human rights, which is hugely important, particularly when you're thinking about China. Let me try and end on a slightly more optimistic note. How do we deal with morbid symptoms? Even though I'm quite pessimistic. My fear is, I'm starting to be pessimistic first, is that actually what we'll get is, instead of a classic war, which would destroy everything, what I call a new war, which is low-level violence, the disintegration of the state and public services. Actually already seeing it in the United States. And that kind of new war, which we see in the Balkans, we see in Syria, large parts of Africa, is incredibly difficult to end. And so my fear is this could be multiplying morbid symptoms, could be our long-term future. What Biden winning will mean is not that we're going to be able to solve the problems. Biden is having, Biden will face the social monster of Trumpism. Biden will have to deal with China, Russia, and so on. Biden will have to deal with the fact that the American brand has been hugely tarnished by Trump and is no longer so effective. So he'll have to work with the European Union, with Australia and others. But what Biden does do is to give us openings for doing stuff. And, globalization isn't just about the global market. It's about global communication. It's about global conversation, as Joe would put it. It's about global consciousness. It's about our being concerned about the planet, our being concerned about humanity. It's about global civil society. And I think it's only through action from below, through global civil society at local level, that we're actually going to address these issues. We've got to engage in a dialogue with all those Trump supporters. We've got to find ways to give them a new sense of empowerment in a different direction. Change in the end has to come from below. So I will finish just by saying I think this initiative of a conversation is one way of getting that going. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And this initiative is hopefully going to at least start this conversation and generate the difficult questions that need to be asked. Moving on to our next speaker, who will, I expect, present more questions, the Honourable Bob Carr. So the Honourable Bob Carr is industry professor at the University of Technology in Sydney and works with the Institute for Sustainable Futures, bringing his unique skills and experience to diverse portfolios, including business and industry, international relations, climate change, research and policy. He is the longest serving Premier of New South Wales and known to many Australians for his role as former Foreign Affairs Minister to the country. Please welcome the Honourable Bob Carr.
Tasneem, a great pleasure to be talking with you and your friends and colleagues. I take it you can hear me?
Yes.
Good. I enjoyed very much hearing Mary, and it's a pleasure to be talking with a group sponsored and encouraged by Joseph Camilleri. And I enjoyed hearing from John Nichols because I think highly of the magazine he writes for. It's important to make this point with America so big in our thoughts and our discussions. And it's this: it's wrong to think of the United States as a democracy. And we can understand much more about America if we grasp this point. America engages in democracy promotion around the world and is pleased to think of it as a birthplace of one birthplace of democratic ideas and ideals. It doesn't bear analysis. This is a bit of mythology, and we understand America more deeply if we understand that two things on their own: voter suppression practices, which are systemic and designed to deter poor people from voting and coloured people, and the Electoral College, which filters the outcome of an election like the one we witnessed on Tuesday, and which might well award the election to Donald Trump, or could have done until the turn that voting took place in the last 24 hours. The Electoral College and voter suppression, these are characteristics entirely incompatible with a democracy. No West European country, not Australia, not New Zealand, would allow governments to pursue a practice that deters, for example, in New Zealand, Maori voters from turning out to a polling place, or Asian background voters in the United Kingdom. It'd be regarded as an embarrassment and an outrage if government practiced this. but it's something that is entrenched in the United States, where Republican-controlled administrations at the state level will adopt practices to deter people of colour, people in poor income neighbourhoods of getting to a polling place, being able to get on the electoral roll to start with, getting to a polling place and casting a vote. Black people have reported queues of 10 hours in Texas, for example, in primary elections held earlier this year. Think of America as a republic, not as a democracy, but as a republic with constitutionally entrenched freedoms for which their founding fathers and their culture deserves respect, but not a democracy. I think we've got to understand race as being at the core of American politics and American society, or as one writer said, ethnic antagonism, which is, I guess, a more polite way of putting it. This writer, Larry Bartels, did research on the partisan consequences of rising levels of racial and ethnic animosity, and polling 1,500 Republican voters earlier this year, he reached this conclusion. A majority of those Republicans expressed agreement with the proposition that, quote, the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. The traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast, we may have to use force to save it. And more than 40% agreed that a time will come when patriotic Americans have to take the law into their own hands. Now, this was a response, he argues, to ethnic antagonism, an anger at the fact that America is becoming gradually a majority-minority nation. The research is worth looking at, and the more I reflect on American history, the more I reflect on the consistency with which racial antagonism, ethnic antagonism, explains different events in its history from the time of the Civil War. For example, the realignment of American party politics in the late 1960s in response to the Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, embracing federal intervention to enforce race equality in the southern states. Overnight, almost, the Democratic Party no longer received majority support in the South. It had been the party of the South for about a century, and was replaced by the Republican Party, which pursued the famous or infamous Southern strategy designed to get white support. It succeeded hugely and is a force today. For Australia as an American ally, I think there's this challenge. Is the American alliance to be the most important part of our international personality? Because right now it is. Even though we've had an alliance with America from 1951, there have been times in our history when Australian leaders, when Canberra has been confident enough to express differences with the US and to manage those differences. Right now, I think our political leadership is so lacking in maturity and confidence, we are intimidated to say to a US Secretary of State or to an American president, my friend, you know, we are with you on so many things. We're in agreement, but we disagree with you on this or that, and we'd like you to think about our position, which is different from yours. It simply doesn't happen. Does your generation feel comfortable with a state of affairs where Australia's only international character is to be the most slavishly pro-Washington of all of America's allies? I can give examples, but it might be better if we came to them later. Right now, we're in the peculiar position where on China, our forward-leaning, demonstrative and flamboyant criticism of China, when diplomatic language would have better suited our objectives, is seeing us lose markets in China, or so it seems, markets that America will pick up because of Trump's phase 1 trade deal with Xi Jinping. It's remarkable. We demonstrate our loyalty to America by running out in front of America's other allies to promote an international inquiry that will be critical of China on coronavirus management, or to be the first of America's allies to ban Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications company. But America looks at what we do, pats us on the head, and is in a position where its Californian winemakers take the markets that Australia's lost, or where its beef exporters move into the Chinese market, where Australia has sent 40% of its beef exports, but they now look in danger. Where someone exporting lobsters from Maine is going to be selling them to distributors in China who up till now had bought lobsters from Australia. Are we strong enough to say to America, we're a good ally, as you know, we work with you on so many fronts, but we're going to pursue a policy on China that reflects our national interest. Our national interest. Is Australia confident enough to say we too can have a pragmatic national interest-based policy with China, one that doesn't overlook our differences with China, one where we are not silenced on something like the loss of legal autonomy for Hong Kong or the mistreatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province? We can maintain our position on this, but at the same time, make it clear to the US that we've got vital interests in China, and not just in trade. What is the international personality you want your country to have? I'd like Australia to be a world leader on climate, not a laggard. The prospect of a Biden presidency is very exciting on climate. He's saying we'll aim for net zero emissions by 2050. He's saying all oil and coal out of the US power system, out of their electricity grid by 2035. He's saying economic stimulus through an electric vehicle fleet and other initiatives. Now, Australia, unlike the UK and the EU, unlike Canada, unlike Japan, as of 2 weeks ago, unlike China, Xi Jinping's statement in September, unlike South Korea, which is committed to a Green New Deal, we're not saying we're aiming at net zero emissions by 2050. With the Chinese, it's 2060. But Biden's election means that our American ally, recruiting allies for what Biden calls climate-based diplomacy, a climate alliance, has got to overlook Australia. Australia is now categorized with Saudi Arabia and Brazil. Brazil, the Trump of the tropics, Bolsonaro, is burning the Amazon to a husk. And we are in the same category. At international conferences, we're going to be metaphorically seated between the Saudi Crown Prince and President Bolsonaro of Brazil, with the rest of the world saying, as Boris Johnson said to Australia, the Australian Prime Minister a few days ago, are you going to get serious about climate? Are you going to get serious about climate? I would like to have, as one part of Australia's international personality, a forward-leaning and positive approach to shifting the balance of forces in the world to protection of the environment of this planet, the only planet we've got. So it's a great pleasure to be talking with you about these challenges. If I'm leaving somebody, I imagine that many of you are involved in politics or serious students of international relations or both. I just leave you with this challenge of thinking about the international personality you would like your country, Australia, to have, and to think about the challenges of our relations with the US, which is not a democracy, but a republic, one where race plays a huge, disproportionate part in their political and social life, and to think about the prospect that we might run a policy with China based on pragmatism and our own national interest without selling out any values that we hold important. And think about us working with a Biden administration, which I hope will be confirmed within 24 hours, on climate, because young people have got a huge stake in us getting to those Paris targets and not leaving behind a degraded and compromised planet.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bob. That is a great way to end, because we are hoping to speak to some of our young leaders shortly. But before we do that, we have a brief interlude with some beautiful musical performance from the Omari sisters. I'm really excited to introduce their brother, actually, who is joining us, Merve, to speak about the journey of his two sisters from the DRC, originally via Malawi, where they came 8 years ago, and whose practice of singing is informed by a sense of endurance, hope and resilience, which we'll hear about in their songs. But first of all, Merve, welcome.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
No, we're delighted.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can, absolutely. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
I was
Awesome.
wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about the journey that yourself and your sisters, Jemima and Miriam, have gone through to get to this point where you now have a performing ensemble.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, basically, we're from DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. We left in 1996, where civil war broke out, and we went into Malawi. And we were living in Malawi for 8 years as refugees. And it was in September of 2004 that we came into Sydney, Australia. And we've been in Australia ever since.
Wonderful.
And so singing has always been a part of our family, a part of our culture. And so, yeah, it's just it's a great honor to be able to come in and share that in this platform. Yeah, so it's good.
Oh, it's great to have you here. And can I ask, Merve, in terms of the performances that you do, are they in English? Are they in Congolese? I mean, in what languages would we hear typically your sisters singing in?
Well, it just varies. It varies with where we're at, what context, what gathering it is. We all speak Swahili. And so if we're in a Swahili gathering, we'll sing in Swahili, or if we're in a multicultural gathering, they'll sing in English. So it just depends, but it's good to be able to just communicate the message to different groups of people.
Fantastic. And the songs that you'll be singing, I know we've got one song coming now, and also one song to close the session, which I encourage our attendees to stick around for. The first song that you're singing today, what's that about? Well,
that song, it's basically about hope. It's a song that this song we would sing it, especially in Malawi. We would sing it to sort of reflect on the good things that has happened to us in the past. Like I said, in 1996, we left our homeland of Congo, and that was due to war. So this song is always reminding us to be also thankful that we've made it this far, because there were so many people that didn't make it. So it's a song to reflect and to be very thankful for what's happened in our life. And what's the name of this song? The name of the song is Nasema Asante. So basically it means I'm saying thank you. All right, beautiful. Well, asante sana, and thank you for your sharing your story. And please, everybody, enjoy a performance by Jemima and Miriam Omari, the Omari sisters.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Nasema asante kwa Mungu wangu, nasema asante kwa wema wako, kwa maana fadhili zako zadumu milele na milele. Amina. Nasema asante kwa Mungu wangu, nasema asante kwa wema wako, kwa maana fadhili zako zadumu milele na milele. Amina. Nitaimba sifa zako mbele ya watu wote, nitaimba sifa zako mbele ya watu wote, kwa maana fadhili zako zadumu milele na milele. Amina. Kwa maana fadhili zako zadumu milele na milele. Amina. Kwa maana fadhili zako zadumu milele na milele. Amina. Milele na milele. Amina. Hakika wema nazo fadhili zitanifuata mimi, nitakaa nyumbani mwa Bwana siku zote za maisha yangu. Hakika wema nazo fadhili zitanifuata mimi, nitakaa nyumbani mwa Bwana siku zote za maisha yangu, siku zote za maisha yangu, siku zote za maisha yangu.
Wow, that was beautiful. And I encourage you all, please stick around. We will be closing the session with another performance from the sisters towards the end. So that is definitely worth waiting for. But now moving on to what the Honourable Bob Carr inferred in his presentation about the youth and or young leaders and the voices of what young leaders are bringing to this conversation. And we are so excited to be bringing with you some top Australian intellectual voices in this space. The first is Lisa Carson. Dr. Lisa Carson is the voluntary coordinator of the Young Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in Australia, which is part of a global organisation nominated for a 2020 Nobel Peace Prize this year. Her research and activism revolve around inequity and ways in which to bring about socially progressive change with a focus on foregrounding marginalised perspectives and better connecting theory, practice and advocacy. It sounds like a thesis title. That's amazing. She does hold a PhD and is currently a research fellow at the University of New South Wales. She will be joined by Tim Lasordo. Tim is the founder and national director of Democracy in Colour, Australia's first racial and economic justice organisation led by people of colour. He's deeply passionate about people-powered change, has helped low-paid workers set up Hospo Voice, which is a new union in hospitality. Previously, he headed campaigns at Oaktree, served as senior advisor to 2 federal senators, and was campaign director at Jatka, which is a movement of 1.9 million people taking action for a fairer India, and National Comms Director at UN Youth Australia. Please welcome Dr. Lisa Carson and Tim Lusordo.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by acknowledging the lands on which I'm on, those of the Rawandji people, and pay my respects to those past, present, and emerging, and note that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to thank Joe for the invitation to take part tonight. I'm an optimist at heart. Whether the glass is half full or empty, I'm glad that there's glass and that there's water involved. But when I look at the state of US politics, regardless of the winner, and granted, I understand the early joy with Biden, my reaction is tempered by the degree and extent to which the humanity of our politics and practice has been lost in the process. The polarization and echo chambers of both the emboldened left and right, media concentration and opinions over facts, systemic race and institutional discrimination, governing for the next election rather than purpose, short-term thinking over long-term legacies, divisiveness over unity, fear over resilience, and an individualism over the collective. Rather than despair and paralysis, this needs to be our fuel for change. What we're seeing unfold in the US is cause for reflection here in Australia and abroad about how we can collectively guard against a similar path defined by entrenched inequity, rather build and deepen our own for the betterment of all, not just a few. When it comes to our institutions of power, we need to continually question who they work for and why, and who they don't. While some will rightfully point to increased diversity, significant structural change within Western institutions remains elusive beyond the surface, characterized by tinkering rather than tackling, when it's tackling that we need. We see this when we look at the representation of young people. People under the age of 25 make up nearly half of the world's population, yet their voices are largely missing, with only 1.65% of parliamentarians in their 20s. We see this when we look at climate change. We only have 10 years left to prevent irreversible damage, with at least 1 in 4 species at risk of extinction. And we know that 83% of young people here in Australia are wanting significant change. We see this when we look at traditional Western foreign policy. Instead of more transformative, multidimensional feminist approaches that elevate marginalized groups' perspectives and experiences and scrutinize the intersecting forces of patriarchy, racism, capitalism, colonization, heteronormativity, imperialism, and militarism. And so what are we going to do about this? Well, we need to move beyond a West is best mantra and genuinely embrace place-based perspectives. We have the oldest living Indigenous culture in the world, whereby over 500 tribes coexisted for over 60,000 years. Yet Indigenous and First Peoples diplomacy is rarely valued in our practice. Regionally, New Zealand has moved to a wellbeing budget and has just appointed its first female Indigenous foreign minister. Put simply, there are different ways of doing things, and young people are hungry for this. Without change at all levels, we risk our institutions and practices becoming places and processes of irreversible intergenerational theft, rather than long-term sustainability, equity, and justice for all. Thank you very much. And I will, in the interest of time, hand over to Tim and look forward to any questions in the discussion.
Hi folks, thanks so much for having me. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're on. I'm personally on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, but wherever we are, if we're on the continent of Australia, we're all on stolen land and sovereignty was never ceded. The main point I want to talk to briefly is the critical importance, I believe, of understanding the system that has enabled the last 4 years of Trump, rather than just looking at the very loud symptoms. Donald Trump is an incompetent, corrupt, racist, sexist authoritarian whose fascist tendencies have represented an existential threat to US democracy, whose self-serving agenda has seen him personally profit off the presidency whilst serving as the personal fixer for the most corrupt extreme and dangerous elements in the United States. But I don't believe Trump is the problem. And like Mary was referencing earlier, I don't think he's an aberration of business as usual, but rather a symptom of a broader broken status quo. He's the end product of the successive failures of neoliberalism and predatory capitalism, which have seen the aspirations, dignity, and bodies of working people exploited to serve the interests of mega corporations and billionaires, the same system that has facilitated spiraling inequality and paycheck to paycheck living for working people. It's the same system that's seen US billionaires become $845 billion wealthier during the first 6 months of the pandemic, whilst working people have lost their jobs. And it's the same system that saw Jeff Bezos, who's well on his way to becoming the world's first trillionaire, add $13 billion to his net worth in one day on July 20. And I want to focus on the environment from which Trump has come from, because I think understanding the problem is essential. That you can't hope for a solution if you don't have an accurate analysis of the problem itself. And the environment that Trump was born out of has been built over many decades, and it's truly terrifying. Whether it's the decades of unrestrained greed or neoliberalism or predatory capitalism that has created an economy that humiliates and dehumanizes working people, whether it's the weaponization of race by fear merchants that gets working people to point the finger of blame at each other instead of the broken rules, whether it's the multi-decade expansion of the unilateral powers of the presidency, whether it's the sweeping powers of war and surveillance that Democrats themselves have voted to give Trump, whether it's a long history of voter suppression or gerrymandering or the Electoral College or whatnot. We could be here forever. I think the point is that you can't separate the past from the present, and taking an ahistorical view to Trump is very dangerous because it dooms us to make the same mistakes that got us here in the first place. And I think the warning for us here in Australia is that parts of the system that have created Trump exist here in Australia too. Not to the same degree, but we too have been ravaged by privatisation, austerity politics and neoliberalism. We live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world at the wealthiest time in human history. And there are more than 116,000 people in this country who are homeless. 3.2 million people live in poverty. That's 1 in 8 people in Australia who live in poverty, below the poverty line. There's the rise of a gig economy undermining employment safety nets, wage and superannuation theft, increasing casualisation, a mental health crisis, black deaths in custody, Indigenous over-incarceration, and I could again go on and on. And I think we've seen our own Trump lights emerge in an attempt to capitalise on this, whether it be your obvious contenders like Pauline Hanson or Peter Dutton or Scott Morrison to a lesser extent. And I think if we want to rout this trend of fear and hate-driven politics, we really need to start dealing with these structural challenges. And we need to start examining how we create an economy that has as its prime prerogative, not growth at all costs, but the maximization of human potential, of human happiness. And how do we view a society that has no one in poverty, that has a home for everybody, that has universal education, that has a dignified work for those who want it? How do we view that society not as aspirational, but as the bare minimum our institutions need to meet to enable a dignified life for everybody? I think that's the critical question we need to be asking and answering as we grapple with these, the symptoms that we're seeing from decades of a broken structure. And I'm really excited to be engaging in that conversation with you all tonight.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for your passion, for your diagnosis, and for your insight there. It's exciting and it's really thought-provoking. Look, to go on from that, I'm happy to welcome back Professor Joe Camilleri, who is now going to moderate a discussion with Tim, Lisa, Bob Carr and Mary Calder. And I ask again, if you have questions, please keep them civil, respectful in the chat box. We do have about, quite a number there already. So you have your work cut out for you. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Tasneem. I think it would help me in terms of fielding some of the questions to our panel if people would from now on to put their questions into the Q&A basket rather than the chat basket. Otherwise, I'd have to be looking at both simultaneously, which can be rather distracting. We won't be able to deal with all the questions, but I'll try and put similar questions into a bracket and see what the panel makes of some of those. I won't quote the question word for word. I will paraphrase to maximize the amount of input from the people who are taking part in this event and the responses from our panel. Okay, so let's start with what's happening in the United States as a start off to the discussion we're going to have, and then branch out to the world. And of course, Australia will be part of that. It looks as if we may have a change of presidents, of the presidency in the United States. And many of you have addressed that question, but I want to put the same question I was trying to put to John Nichols earlier today, and that is this, that even with the best of intentions, and let's assume that Joe Biden does have the best of intentions on a number of fronts, be it, of course, climate change, racial tensions, racism more generally, the COVID pandemic, and so on. Is the changing of the guard in the United States going to bring about more than just a change of president? Are we going to see a whole group of people at various levels, right from the top further down, who understand what a different agenda looks like, number one, who understand the roadblocks that stand in the way, that have an understanding of the causes that led us to some of the problems we've been experiencing in the United States and elsewhere, and can then bring about strategies that can overcome these roadblocks. And I say this with this at the back of my mind. Obama, 8 years ago, came with enormous enthusiasm and great expectations. And we all remember the famous phrase, "Yes, we can." But in some respects, he helped to make Trump possible, or at least I see it that way. And because the 8 years failed to deliver on so many fronts, they delivered some things, but well short. You could argue about a hostile Senate. You could argue about the deep divisions in the United States, but they're precisely the kinds of, you can argue about a Supreme Court that may not want to pursue an interpretation of the law that has progressive implications. But that's precisely the same problems that a Biden presidency will be facing, as did the former Democrat president. So can we really look to the Biden presidency in the United States as helping to turn things around in substantive as opposed to just cosmetic ways? I invite all of you to try and answer that, whether you do it from an optimistic or less optimistic perspective. Let's see what all four of you think about that. Would you like to start us off, Mary?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways I started to answer that by saying I think that all Biden can do is to offer us an opening. He's not going to control the Senate. That's a contrast with Obama. Obama really failed to use his majorities in the Senate and the House in the first couple of years. And that means he's going to have great difficulty changing the Supreme Court. So what he can do is very limited. What I wanted to address were two issues that I think are really important and that have come up in the chat and relate to what Biden can do. One issue which none of us hardly talked about was social media. And I do agree so much with those people in the chat who felt that that was really important. And whether I look at Brexit or Trump or Putin, their mastery of simple messages on social media is really frightening. I mean, Putin talks about non-linear war, which is what he practiced in Ukraine, which is the idea of destabilizing countries through what he calls political technology. And, I watched a program on our television on Channel 4 News about Florida. So many of the Latinas were convinced by social media messages that Biden was no different from Hugo Chavez or Fidel Castro. And the Democrats didn't seem to have a strategy for dealing with. There was a little bit of limitation by Facebook and Twitter, but nothing like enough. And we need to develop some kind of strategy for dealing with that. The other issue I wanted to raise was how to engage with the Trumpites. How we get, they are going to be there and they're going to be trying to win again in 4 years' time, when Biden will probably have to step down because he's so old. And so hadn't we better start thinking about how to address that problem now? When Brexit happened in Britain, I sort of noticed that nobody was actually going to the left behind areas. So I organized a project with a group of PhD students. And we went to some of the leave areas. We couldn't go to all of them. And we talked to local stakeholders about what Brexit meant. And we held meetings with both people who were both for and against Brexit. But we didn't discuss Brexit. We discussed what it meant for their areas. We deliberately avoided, or why people felt the way they did, but we didn't have a straight, are you for or against discussion. And I think what was absolutely striking to me, several people said racism was a red herring. It wasn't really about democratic change. What it was a deep sense of disempowerment. They really felt nothing they could do would change the situation. And it was this huge political frustration that was really holding them back. And it's quite interesting in the British context that exactly identical demographic constituencies in Scotland, left behind areas in Scotland, voted against Brexit. And they did so because they felt they had opportunities through the Scottish Parliament. So there was people discussed, couldn't we have a local political forum? Couldn't we have more devolution? So I think that thinking about that and thinking about the kind of changes to how our politics work is going to be absolutely critical, and thinking about maybe constitutional rules too. I mean, in America as well, Bob gave us a wonderful description of what was wrong with American democracy. And I was thinking, it's weird that the Electoral College was invented by the founding fathers to prevent populism, and it's actually enabled populism. Those Electoral College people were supposed to prevent stupid populist people to become president. Anyway, I just really wanted to say that I think actually thinking about what we do at the grassroots, what kind of campaigns we run, is going to be more critical than thinking about what Biden himself can do, because what he's going to be able to do is very limited.
The three of you now, Bob, would you like to add some thoughts on this?
Yeah, Joe, I'm very positive about Biden's instincts on the environment. I know a couple of his advisors, and they're very serious about this commitment. They're determined to win. Without a Senate majority, he won't be able to get, I suspect he won't be able to get his big green initiatives as economic stimulus, a green stimulus. And that worries me. But he's going to use the president's power to get things done by directives. For example, he'll roll back the 100 presidential directives that came from Trump repealing environmental regulations. Biden has said, to his great credit, on his first day as president, he will make a direction forcing new standards about the use of methane on the oil and gas sectors. Now, that alone, as far as I'm concerned, that alone would vindicate his election, given the impact that methane is having as a result of escape from all the phases of the gas production process in the upper atmosphere. So he's very, very positive on that. Here's a challenge. He's expressed his his opposition to what he and Sanders and others, what Trump himself has referred to as the endless wars, the wars without end, Afghanistan, the longest in America's history, Iraq, he might include Libya on the list, although that commitment was made when he was vice president. But I think he will be less ready than other modern presidents for that American instinct of military intervention. I mean, when I went to the Capitol building as foreign minister, I met John McCain, who's admirable in so many respects. But when I said to him, well, what would you do about Syria? Mary would be interested in this as someone who studied the Syrian civil war. His response, well, I'd do whatever Ronald Reagan would have done. That's what we enjoy saying around here, whatever Ronald Reagan would have done. I spoke to a former US Secretary of State. I said, well, what would you do about Syria? He said, I think we should pick a side and just back it. That is, pour in military support. This instinct of America to always go for military intervention, and often as an alternative to clear diplomatic possibility, is something that in my bones, I think Biden will be inclined to resist. Whether he goes as far as the very interesting and newly established Quincy Institute based in Washington, which argues comprehensively for an end to military interventions and for more diplomacy, is a tough question. Can I just conclude with one story about him, which I think points to a desire by him to negotiate. My one meeting with him was in the White House in, I think, January 2013. And he's very charming. He's a politician's politician. He engages you. He's got all those Irish American political skills. But the most important story he told was about how he and Xi Jinping, both vice presidents of their countries, had long conversations together, and how Xi Jinping wanted to talk to him about the relationship between the political leadership and the military leadership in America, how it worked in America. What I took out of the way Biden told that story was that today, 7 years on, I think he's comfortable about sitting down and talking to the Chinese leader. He wants to engage with him on climate. He wants to engage with him on pandemic management. What he does about trade and Taiwan, we simply don't know. He would continue the tech warfare with China, I would think, and he'd be aggressive about protection of intellectual property. But I think his instincts will be to talk, to promote diplomacy, to see if he can cut deals. And this I find very promising.
Bob. Now, either Tim or Lisa or both of you, a couple of thoughts on that general question?
Yeah, sure. I think it largely depends on how Biden would be able to bring people together. So how to speak across rather than speak to. And you see that in his framing of talking about, I will govern for all of the states, the United States, not blue, not red states. So I think that will be a really critical part. And I think it's we have to remind ourselves here, America is armed. So there's been, a huge influx in people purchasing guns and boarding up places. And I think that's something that the divisiveness and how that's felt and the inability for people to be able to talk across is really concerning, both in the short term and the long term. And I think that, people have described 4 years of Trump as survivable, but 8 years as terminal. So I think there's also a bigger picture here about what normalizing certain practices and processes can mean for the political nature moving forward, well into the future. And again, I think there's a lot of perhaps reflection to be done, obviously on both parties, but particularly within the Democrats. And when you look at Biden, who, has backflipped on fracking, and then you have someone like Bernie Sanders who would come out and kind of lay out and stand by claims in a more kind of definitive way. So I think, long term, we need to reflect on what is lost by compromising both within parties, but then also what is lost by compromising between left and right, and what that means, and on what terms and on when are you best to compromise for a greater gain. So I think, again, we can look to the US, and it's going to be how it plays out is going to be difficult to watch perhaps, but there are learnings there for Australia. And Mary, your point about media and social media in particular is incredibly important. We don't understand and we don't critique enough the role that algorithms play, that social media plays, that media concentration plays, particularly here in Australia with the concentration of Murdoch. But these are all things that we need to be mindful of and guard against and learn from afar.
Tim, did you want to add something?
Sure. I mean, I think generally there are limits to what elected officials can do, whether they be Biden or otherwise, because these are people who play in a game whose rules are determined and set by other interests. I think the caveat to my answer, though, is that I believe who sits in decision-making roles is critically important. Like, two things can be true at the same time. And I don't think that Hillary Clinton and Trump were the same. I don't think Biden and Trump are the same. I think COVID-19 is a prime example. Trump's response to the pandemic has been criminally negligent, incompetent denialism, conspiracy theories, and anti-science agenda. It's seen some 9.5 million cases, some 234,000 deaths. A few months ago, the US had around 25% of the world's cases and 25% of the world's deaths. It now has about 20% on each, despite having only 4% of the world's population. And this is, again, the wealthiest country in the history of the world that has had the worst response to the pandemic. And I think that's, I think you could reasonably lay at Trump's feet, about half of those deaths. Trump has been personally responsible through his complete and utter criminally negligent mismanagement of the pandemic for, probably a conservative estimate of 100,000 deaths within the 234,000 deaths that have happened so far, and the worst is yet to come. And so I think who's in office matters. But at the same time, I think we need to move away from these hero complexes. The way we are so reliant on elected officials, on mythologizing and creating heroes out of people, whether that be, Biden or Obama or, Bernie Sanders or people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I think in reality, we just need to recognize that the way you contest organized money is through organized people. We need to do the same thing with people, with what the other side does with money. And that's the only way we create the level of power we need to challenge the entrenched status quo that has everything invested in how business as usual is operating right now, is by coming together as communities, is building our own community power, and is by challenging those interests. And I think we do that by expanding our sense of democracy. I think for most of us, our experience of democracy is limited to voting every 3 years. And democracy is not a spectator sport, as they say. It's, we need to get active. We need to join political parties. We need to run for office ourselves. Imagine that, ordinary people instead of political staffers and, lawyers and all that sort of stuff running for office. We need to join our local community organizations on whatever issues we're passionate about. We just need to do something, whatever that is. And I think we need to be vigilant about protecting our democratic systems. The promise of democracy is that inequality of resource can be breached by equality of voice. And that promise is being perverted by money in politics, by mega corporations, political lobbyists, the revolving door of politician lobbyists. And we need wide-ranging reforms to prevent this perversion. And I think the final thing that I touched on before was taking a systems lens to the critical issues that we're facing.
Can I leap in and very quickly give a couple of examples of how that people power concept has worked? Can I do that?
Please do.
Yeah, there's a great example out of these
quick ones.
Yeah, very quick one. Great example out of these elections is a black woman. She was a member of the State House in Georgia. She stood for governor 2 years ago. She was defeated by flagrant voter suppression practiced by her Republican opponent, who had been Secretary of State in the state administration in Georgia and had excluded black and Latino people from the ballot. Stacey Abrams got organised in this election. And if later tonight we hear that Biden has won the state of Georgia, it's because she mobilised black people to get on the rolls and turn out and vote and defy the voter suppression practices of the Republicans. A second example, I'm engaged in a campaign, the campaign of our Prime Minister for a gas-led recovery, because that would see Australia blow our Paris targets. One thing that's really taken off is action by shareholder groups at general meetings of corporations, including some big corporations, to force boardroom policy of no investment in thermal coal or gas. And you'd be astonished at how insurance companies, even the big four banks, have annoyed our Prime Minister by signing up to those policies as a result of people who organise as shareholders and make a fuss, put motions on the agenda. I know it's hard to believe, but it's having this effect. That big proposed, the Adani coal mine, for example, won't get a cent in loans from any Australian institution because of that shareholder pressure by environmental activists.
Thanks, Bob. Well, now, there have been a lot of questions, as you can imagine. Let me just bring a number of questions under a couple of headings and see what you make of them. One of them relates to exactly the things we've been talking about. There is an undertone in much of what all four of you have said, that there is a lot that people can do. But the question that seems to come up again and again in different guises is this. But if our media, both mainstream, more traditional media, and the new media, the social media, are not alive to this possibility and to this need, do we have the capacity, other than operating in small groups, to, if you like, reach out to a large cross-section of the community when both mainstream and social media seem to be, on the whole, unhelpful in this regard? Anyone wanted to get into this question of how we handle what is at best uninterested and in some cases hostile media? How do we handle that? Anyone?
There's certainly one thing I would say, which is that we do need to regulate social media so that it's not possible to circulate lies. But on the other hand, I think progressive forces can often do fantastic, just as well as the right on the social media. I just don't think the Democrats did. But I think social media does offer a way of getting around the dominant formal media. So, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. But obviously, we do have to change something in terms of formal media. I mean, it's just ridiculous that we've had so many scandals in the UK about hacking, you know, the dominance of the tabloid press, which really gave rise to the Brexit phenomenon in exactly the same way that Fox News gave rise. We have to think of ways to regulate the media and to make them much more accountable.
There is, if anyone wants to add something, please indicate. Tim?
Look, I think that's the power of what we were talking about before. It's the power of people-powered campaigning and community organising, that you skip the middle person, you go straight to people. And that's why so many civil society organisations, at least in Australia and in the United States, have really sort of seen this resurgence and this renaissance in investing in community organising, because the sort of communications apparatus that exists is rigged, especially in Australia, as has been previously mentioned, with Murdoch's complete dominance of the field here. And I think we need to engage our neighbours in conversation, in face-to-face conversation about how the status quo is failing our families. We need to engage them in conversations about what a just, sustainable society that works for everyone looks like. And then we engage them in conversation about how we can make that a reality. And we, form local grassroots groups that pressure and hold and remind our local representatives who they work for, that they work for us, they work for communities, and we hold them accountable. And then, come at the ballot box, we vote them out if they're not enforcing our agenda, and we vote in representatives that do. I think that's broadly, the way we get. Obviously, that's very sort of reductive, and it's more complicated than that. But I think at a high level, that's what a lot of civil society has been trying to do over the last few years, and we're starting to see some of the fruit of that work, slowly but surely.
If I can add something to that, I completely agree with you, but as somebody who's spent a lifetime as an activist, I do actually think community organising is greatly facilitated by social media. We think about social media in terms of the dark web and all the effects it has on isolated people, but actually the ability to come together and to meet virtually as well as physically, to have WhatsApp groups that you're consulting, all of that actually hugely facilitates. I mean, in the old days, it always depended on going door to door, which was good, and on address lists, and stamping envelopes and all of those things. And this just speeds all of that up.
I think it's an enabler. I think it's an augmenter. I think that there is absolutely no substitute. I think at the end of the day, change happens when real people do real things in the real world.
I agree.
And technology is about amplifying how that can happen, the speed and the scale of how it can happen, but it's not a substitute for that.
Okay. Lisa, you can add your comments in relation to the question I'm about to put, which will be the last question, okay? It's this. I'd be interested to hear what Mary has to say in relation to European allies of the United States, and of course for the other three in relation to Australia. Several members of the panel, if not all, have indicated their interest, their wish that Australia should be able to act independently, should be able to act on the great issues within the country, be it climate change, relations with our indigenous peoples, whether it be handling questions of poverty and unemployment, and of course on the world stage, taking up responsible positions of a good international citizen. And the questions are asking, but do we have the political leadership? Do we have the wherewithal to think that that is a feasible possibility? As I said, we can think about Australia, but I'd be interested to hear from Mary about what she thinks is feasible, possible in the European context. Who?
Sure.
Yes,
Thanks, Joe. Just quickly, and I'll be quick on both. Just in regards to the last question, I think we really need to reflect and understand that we're living in a post-truth world where people can make up their own opinions and take them as fact, and scientific evidence doesn't count in the same way that it used to. So I think we all need to reflect on how to relate to people in our conversations and understand the importance of emotion and narrative and story that goes with that, because science only gets us so far. If everyone was scientific acting decision makers, we wouldn't have the climate that we have, and we wouldn't have the situation that we have. So I think that's really important for all activism and advocacy in that space, to understand, what it means to be post-truth, what it means for everyone's opinion to feel as though it's fact, and feel emboldened to undermine evidence as we know it. Your most recent question, Joe, I think in terms of what does an international, is there political leadership moving forward in that space, and what does it mean to be a good international citizen? I think Bob's question is a fantastic one to pose around, what does Australia's identity want to be now and into the future? And what's the legacy that our current leaders are creating in order to work towards that? And how viable is that moving forward? So I think that there's a lot to be done in that space, and that we're often only privy to, we often only think about change, and a lot of emphasis, as Tim pointed out, is put on our politicians to affect change. But when you think of social change as a puzzle, our institutions and governments arguably are a huge significant one of that. But the other big pieces of the puzzle come from civil society, come from our universities, come from the way in which we are able to relate and have conversations and organize with people. So at the same time, you know, we need good people everywhere and at all levels simultaneously, and allyship, and to be able to build a collective kind of identity to work towards, and to have leaders who can shape a vision and stand for something and want to create a legacy, not another election, or not governing for another election. But that's enough from me, so I'll hand over to everyone else.
Okay, well, I'll just say one thing. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I feel part of what we're trying to do is to restore truth and evidence. And actually, that was really my initial aim when I organized this local Brexit project. I wanted, you know, I'm at LSE and people do economic statistics and all of this. And I wanted to bring them our evidence about Brexit and say to them, do you agree with this? You know, what's it going to do to your town? And I think restoring evidence and truth is hugely important. Now to Joe's question on Europe. I mean, I think what's been reassuring has been that actually, by and large, of course, we have Poland, we have Hungary, but by and large in Europe, we have the European continental countries, as we would say in Britain. We're still in a world where politicians, even if you disagree with them, do respond to evidence and truth. And I think that what happened when the pandemic, the recovery fund that was agreed, has represented a huge break with the past. The problem with the European Union, which I've always been very committed to as a project because I felt it was a peace project, and I still feel that. It brought Europe together after the Second World War and after the Cold War, and it has an external policy that's explicitly based on human security and not on geopolitics, although some people think it should be more geopolitical. It was hugely problematic because of its emphasis on neoliberalism and because of the stark inequalities that were developing in Europe. This recovery fund that has been agreed is, I think, of huge significance. It represents a reversal of that. And I think the European Union, both Ursula von der Leyen and Angela Merkel, are kind of illustrating how important it is to have women at the top. They represent a really powerful pair of women that are actually developing new policies. And we will have next year this Future of Europe Stakeholder Conference. I think what's also happening, I'm somebody who's always been very close to social movements and civil society. And one of the things that's changed in the last few years is that social movements tend to be very locally focused. And what we really needed was civil society pressure on the European Union. I think we're beginning to see that changing, and that's of huge significance. I think we'll see more and more pan-European social activists participating in the Future of Europe conference. So what does it mean in terms of your question, Joe, about the world order and everything? I think what it means is that the European Union will act independently. It won't automatically go along with Joe Biden because it's acted independently vis-a-vis the United States during the Trump years. And it's going to it should be playing quite a significant role. Of course, the big problem with the European Union is that it somehow very rarely acts politically. I mean, it's ridiculous that the European Union hasn't played more of a role in Syria, it's the area most affected by it. And it pays all the money, but it doesn't have a political role. And so the question is really, the big question in the future, is the European Union going to get more political? because that's what really needs to happen.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to add any thoughts? Okay, well, I think we're all very deeply indebted. We're very grateful to the contributions you've all made. We've covered a lot of ground. We haven't exhausted it by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there's food for thought and food for action in terms of what each one of us in our respective environments might be able to do locally, nationally, and perhaps internationally. So I want to thank all of you, Mary, Bob, Tim and Lisa, for sharing your insights with you. And we very much hope to keep in touch with you and hope that we can make in our small, each in his small or her small way, a bit of a contribution towards the kind of future we've been talking about. So thank you again to all of you. And now, Tasneem, it's over to you. And of course, I thank you in anticipation of your contribution this evening. Thank you.
Thanks. No, thank you, Joe. And thank you to all the panelists. There's been a lot of food for thought, a lot of ideas shared and emotions, and so many brilliant questions, which I'm assuming a lot of you can access and read from your chats. But look, before we do close with a finale from the Omari sisters, I just wanted to bring a few things to the attention of all of you who have kindly taken the time to join, to participate, and that is to give to there's a online donation that we've started, a crowdfunding page. We have a basic goal of about 10,500, but the more ambitious goal towards the 15,000 mark, which has already made a great start. You will, at the end of today's session, for those who've registered, receive a link. And on that link will be information about the crowdfunding page. And we ask that you no matter how big or small, please make a contribution, because that's what keeps events like this going. And as you've seen from today, this is just the beginning of a very important conversation, and we will be actually following this up shortly in a few days with a more diagnostic analysis post hopefully what will be an outcome in the US shortly. So there's a few things that will be continued from the work of Conversations at the Crossroads. Please support it if you can. Secondly, in terms of the events that will be coming up, you'll be seeing a slide shortly that is showing you the kind of events that your funding would support. And they range from anything from obviously the session coming up to analyse what's going on after Trump, again on the 17th of November. There'll be some podcasts as well, which we're hoping to initiate, which will be on interesting, captivating topics that provoke thought and discussion. There'll be a two-part series on the future of energy production, again, to understand what is a very clearly a salient issue in climate awareness and engagement for our community. There'll be small discussions encouraged of up to 8 to 10 participants where, it'll be conversations at the pub or at a gathering where we can discuss informally the topics perhaps which we may not be comfortable in a formal setting, and again, diagnose those and break them down. And there'll also hopefully be an innovative series on issues facing Australia in a post-COVID climate, led by Professor Joe, planned in the second quarter of 2021. So there's a variety of issues, variety of formats, whatever suits you, whether it's in person, online, participating in a public setting. There's something there for everybody. Please support it if you can. And lastly, there's a survey. So again, you will be receiving a link to the survey. It will help us inform more critically how to do these better. Give us your honest feedback, critical or otherwise, about what you've enjoyed, what you thought could have more of or less of, and hopefully the organisers will take that on board. I would also again like to offer my thanks to the speakers who've made themselves available for a sizable portion of tonight's evening, including John Nichols, who did the early interview with Joe, Mary Kaldor, the Honourable Bob Carr, Dr. Lisa Carson, Tim Lucerdo, our performers, Jemima and Miriam Omari, Marve, their brother, for attending today. And of course, our behind the scenes team with Joe himself, who's been instrumental in keeping things together. Ben Freeman, Christiane Camilleri, Rita Camilleri, Henry Dalgish, and others who, I'm sorry if I've missed you, but have made tonight a seamless and very, very time-centric event that it has turned out to be. And of course, a massive thank you to all of you who've registered, and at last count there was 200 plus of you. So that's astonishing. You know, it's obviously a very eventful time to set aside that period of engagement with us this evening, to let us into your homes and to share our ideas, and your ideas in a two-way conversation has been fantastic. And again, thank you to the team for making everything such an enjoyable experience. We are going to end with the performance, and I ask you to stick around the Amari Sisters' next and final number, which will close the evening. So I thank you for your participation. Enjoy the evening and see you next time. Good night.
Others roam this planet and call it home. Long after we're gone, countless others will call this planet home. In the meantime, what we do now echoes into the corridors of time. Yet we find so many seeking gain for self, while others roam the planet in search for a home and good health. As the human family, we first must love each other before we can love the planet that we all have the human right to call home. So justice, peace, unity, and compassion must be the common language that we speak to our fellow brothers and sisters. With love as the cord that binds these four values, we will soon get through this. The war, the hunger, the social and civil unrest, the breakdown of families and homes, the disunity. Just hold on. Just hold on. Peace will come. To the homeless, just hold on. To the hopeless, just hold on. Hope will rain down. To the marginalized, just hold on. To our future kings, queens, doctors, mechanics, nurses, entrepreneurs, peacekeepers, and peacemakers, just hold on. We won't let go. We won't let go of hope. We won't let go of peace, love, justice. And to you, hold on to your peace. Don't let go of your hope. You are a step closer to your goal. Don't let go. You're gonna be okay.
Hold on, don't let go. Yeah, hold on, don't let go. Just take one step closer, put one foot in front of the other. You get through this, just follow the light in the darkness. One step closer, put one foot in front of the other. You get through this, just follow the light in the darkness. You're gonna be okay.